Kenny, I'm a Gatlian. You ever been to the big city? Because you're about to, except that it's a space city.
Hey, I hope you had a good time in the slums. Come visit anytime.
You eat for the food?
Or the other stuff.
It's a lot of trauma, trust me. I'm an expert in being traumatized.
High on Life is the latest game from the mind of Justin Roiland and the development team at Squanch Games. Though it's not their first outing, it's probably their most public-facing and attention-grabbing one yet. As of before, they collectively had their hands in very casual games made for VR, such as Accounting and Accounting Plus, designed by Squanch Games, but developed by Crows, and Trover Saves the Universe. High on Life aims to hit a little bit of a higher bar. If you've ever seen or played anything touched by Roiland and his team, such as the very obvious elephant in the room, Rick and Morty, you should know exactly what to expect going in. No surprises here. For newcomers, well, let's just say you need to get accustomed to crass juvenile humor very fast, or this game will not be to your liking at all. You've been warned.
What the fuck? You have to do everything the fucking UI tells you to do?
Yeah. Fuck you, Jane, you piece of shit.
Let's get the easy stuff out of the way first. High on Life was developed by about 50 employees at Squanch Games, and their first thoughts about getting an ambitious new game out the door were probably not to include adjustment options for every minuscule detail, or the level of accessibility options available. Accessibility options are thankfully becoming more of a necessity in game development to help those who need them, but unless the game starts development with it in mind, it's hard to implement those features in an effective way. So with that aside, most of the menus are pretty sparse, with the bare minimum required to pass as options. On Xbox Series consoles, at least, you'll find no option to flip between performance or fidelity mode, no enhanced HDR features, no remappable button layouts or presets, and no options for different audio setups like surround sound or Dolby 5.1. What you see is pretty much what you get. One quality of life setting I would like to point out for those in need would be the enemy chatter and gun chatter frequency settings. If you're the kind of person that can't stand your arsenal and your enemies constantly backseating and yelling obscenities at you ad nauseum, these switches just might save a life. Also, one nice thing that's here are separate sliders for both standard look sensitivity and sensitivity while aiming down sights, something that you'd be hard pressed to play this game without. Of course, for those heathens who grew up on flight simulators that can imagine the analog sticks as nothing more than small flight yokes, the option to invert your directions is here as well. The rest of the menus here are pretty lackluster too. The inventory screen shows your current items, which is nigh pointless besides a couple of written gags, and the weapon mod section is something I initially wrote off as something I would never have to access, as I thought that all the weapons mods were collective upgrades instead of selective ones. And by that, I mean that as you buy or find more mods for the same individual weapon, you can only have one upgrade equipped at a time. It's not really the fault of the menu, but I just wanted to mention it because I thought this decision was confusing and pretty unnecessary. Speaking of confusing, but actually necessary, High on Life has no maps at all. Not even a mini-map to glance over for points of interest or reference to find your way around. This makes backtracking or going off the beaten path a struggle, as a lot of the locations, though very nice to look at, have similar looking winding routes that split off in multiple ways that can leave you doubting your own sense of direction.
Hey, remember that scanner you got? Try using it.
If the ping system that shows your current objective's direction weren't so unreliable at showing you the correct direction, this may not have been such a big deal. Fortunately, there is a radar on the HUD to mark general locations of nearby hostiles.
Man, good God, you know, you just can't win. You're either a drug or you're a slave, I guess.
High on Life begins with a section that I don't want to delve too deep into for spoiler's sake, but I'll just say that it's a pretty fun way to get its players used to the controls and dropped right into the action. You play as a seemingly aimless teenager who spends most of their time playing video games with no real plans for the future. Ouch guys, that hits a little too close to home. Your nameless, faceless character gets accosted by their sister, Lizzie, who plans on throwing a wild house party while your parents are away for a week. Finding a letter on the fridge that proclaims your parents' disappointment in you, you make your way outside with your sister to go to the store for party supplies. Suddenly, an outbreak of alien crafts rain from the sky and land right on your front doorstep. A bulbous yellow slug-like alien named Garmantuous lurches out, grabs and literally smokes your elderly neighbor with one of his tentacle-like appendages, kills off another one of the aliens who seem to disagree with his methods, and then zips away to parts unknown with the rest of his crew. You and your sister, having been hidden behind a parked car, hear a muffled voice from under the deceased alien's body and investigate, finding another small alien in his coat pocket, this time taking the form of what appears to be a gun. After a quick transfer of some bodily fluids, you're able to understand his language. He introduces himself as Kenny, a Gatlian from the planet Gatlas.
These G3 guys are gonna turn your whole species into drugs. Can you handle a gun? Because, I'm kind of a gun, and if you don't use me to kill those G3 grunts, they're gonna fucking kill us.
After a shootout with the G3, a drug cartel led by the aforementioned slug monster Garmantuous, Kenny helps you to steal a warp drive from one of the enemy bases. Bringing it up hastily to a microwave, your house teleports to a new planet, right in the center of a seedy-looking urban sprawl called Blim City.
Yeah, welcome to fucking space!
With Kenny's guidance, you manage to recruit a professional bounty hunter named Gene, who's recently retired after losing his legs, an eye, and his home. He offers to let you use the suit to hunt down the G3 if you give up your house upon death as collateral. Your mission is now laid out before you. Fight through all the Space Mafia's top bosses, kill Garmantuous, and get back to Earth with your sister and house safely. High on Life's story isn't really meant to be taken seriously, as it's used as a vehicle for the game's comedy more than anything. The devs obviously weren't aiming to topple narrative-focused games like PlayStation Studios' litany of modern first-party titles. At every turn, you'll be confronted with characters and gags that make commentary about the current state of video games, politics, drugs, shady corporate business dealings, societal imbalances, and more. Each gag in itself finds a way to get embellished with a poop or a dick joke. Personally, my time watching Rick and Morty passed after about 2 seasons, though I didn't find myself laughing at nearly as many of the jokes as the ones that fell flat. Like all comedy-focused forms of entertainment, not every joke will land with every audience, and this game throws hundreds of those kinds of jokes at you every minute. Whether it's conversations about humans and aliens having differences in sexual anatomy, or a guy in a back alley selling literal gallons of cum for seemingly no reason. It's exactly as raunchy and vile as you've come to expect from Justin Roiland and company. By the game's end, you'll have met a small handful of characters that have their own endearing qualities. Of course, the snark heavily outweighs the sincerity here. Your attachment to them as actual people and not just comic relief may vary. Each new boss or Gatlian you encounter comes packaged with their own flavor of personality, wrapped up in some kind of trope that's played up for laughs. As your own self-insert blank slate of a character finds unexpected success as a rookie bounty hunter, your sister and Gene maintain their own consistent character arcs throughout. Though it all kind of boils down to stop being such shitheads and treat each other better, the narrative is told in a surprisingly well-rounded way that finds hooks to keep you busy and involved. It did feel good to see things through to the end, but at the same time, I don't feel like I really cared enough about what happened to anyone in the story, since so much of the experience was based on throwaway characters and one-liner generating NPCs. In the back of my head, I even started to recognize a pattern where the game introduced a harmless or mild nuisance of a character who crosses your path, and either forces you or gives you the option to choose violence to get past them. And then when you do, another character scolds you for your poor decision-making skills. It didn't ruin the game for me, but I definitely found the joke repetitious as it wore quickly through its welcome.
I'm more than just a knife, you racist. I can tether too. Look up and latch on.
I, and presumably most people, went into High on Life expecting a first-person shooter. But what's weird is that High on Life feels like it isn't interested in being an FPS game first and foremost. Yes, there are guns, or rather gun-like aliens, and they do have different functions to fit the occasion, but I found the game to be more of an action-adventure or platformer title with a bit of Metroidvania thrown in for good measure. A large portion of High on Life is dedicated to combat, but another significantly sized portion has you doing light puzzle solving, jumping, grappling, and air dashing through environments to make your way to new locales and hidden treasure box aliens called lug boxes. Coupled with that ideology, the gunplay isn't as satisfying as you'd expect from modern FPS standards. Kenny, your first weapon and constant companion, is a bare-bones pistol that never gets access to anything more exciting than his alternate firing mode. I'll get to that later. In fact, there's only one Gatlian in the whole game that has automatic fire, and just to avoid spoilers, I'll tell you that it isn't even the function you'll be using it most often for. This also leads me to my next point. If you're familiar with shooting games, you may have heard the differentiating terms projectile or hit-scan weapons come out of a developer's mouth. Hit-scan weapons are your traditional, run-of-the-mill guns that hit their target based on where your reticle is aimed and will hit instantly the moment you pull the trigger. Now imagine the alternative projectile weapons, like a sniper in a Battlefield game or a grenade launcher in Destiny. The bullet or object being fired has travel time and sometimes arcs or is affected by outside forces like distance or wind, and doesn't always hit where you're aiming because your target has moved by the time it reaches them. What if I told you that every single gun in High on Life was a projectile weapon? High on Life does that weird old-school shooter thing where aiming down sights automatically snaps your reticle onto a target when it's near the center of the screen without any further input from the left or the right sticks. That means you can spam the left trigger to ADS over and over, and your reticle will track to your target for you. Sounds good, right? Well, the problem with that is that all of your guns fire projectiles that have travel time. So if you ADS and then immediately fire, the gun snaps onto the last place it tracked the enemy, and the bullet trails behind them, landing somewhere else. While you can aim down the sights of your Gatlian, because of this, I often found my preferred method to be just fire from the hip and pray you hit something you're aiming at the general direction of. Weapons and gunfights found later in the game feel as if they were made around this point of contention as well, only asking you to be pinpoint accurate about 5% of the time. Each Gatlian in your lineup has access to 2 different firing modes, and some come with additional quirks based on aiming down sights for a short time or holding down the right trigger. For example, Kenny shoots standard green bullet projectiles using the right trigger, but pressing the right bumper launches a glob shot from his trick hole. Kenny's words, not mine.
It comes out of my trick hole.
You can think of the glob shot as an arcing, grenade-like blob that launches enemies into the air upon impact, which then gives you the opportunity to further air juggle them with primary fire afterwards. When used in combat, the secondary firing modes have a very long cooldown that can be sped up by feeding your Gatlian a resource called Gatterall that's spread around the environments. A slightly infuriating thing about that is that the same button used to shoot your secondary fire will also feed your Gatlian a Gatterall whenever you intend to use one or not, and these are a resource that you can only keep 3 of at a time without upgrades. It also behooves me to say that I never once upgraded my Gatterall supply because all the other mods were way more fun and important. This became a little bit of a problem in the late game as you're left to cycle through every weapon to see whether or not they have their secondary fire prepared to use, made all the worse by a limited HUD element that's hard to pay attention to while getting shot at. Alright, so the gunplay isn't as tight as you would have liked, but how's the movement? It's okay, is what I would say. It's fun, but it has its own problems as well. At the beginning of the game, the only things you'll be able to do is shoot, sprint, crouch, and jump. Crouching, weirdly enough, is tied to pressing down on the D-pad, a decision I will never truly understand. After you get your bounty hunter suit, you'll be able to purchase upgrades from the local skeezy pawn shop and find new ways to maneuver around obstacles as you progress through the game. There is a rewarding feeling curve to gaining these new abilities, as most of them see you getting faster or getting verticality. However, a lot of movement options are tied to the alternate firing modes of your Gatlians, which leave you fumbling around on the controls to find the right one for the job by tapping left or right on the D-pad, or the Y button several times, or holding the button for an awkwardly long amount of time to access a weapon wheel that only accepts inputs from the left stick. This means that you have to come to a complete halt to open the weapon wheel or risk wasting time pulling out an unintended friend. You also can't buffer the Y button presses to skip over a weapon in the rotation that you know comes first, making the extremely necessary changing of weapons in the middle of a fight a bit of a cumbersome mess. There are also some strange decisions around how the movement systems interact with one another. One being that for some reason, the devs decided that jumping actually slows your character's momentum, which, while maybe more realistic, feels like a drag in a game that also stands vehemently prohibitive against realism. Also, if you jump while sprinting and then shoot while still in the air, your sprint will end once your feet touch the ground. Pretty decent sized spoiler here for a late game upgrade, but I feel it's needed to convey my frustration with some of these systems. Nearly 2/3 of the way through the game, you get a jetpack, but then they give you 2 options for movement with the jetpack. Either tapping and then holding the A button after jumping, or pressing, wait for it, down on the D-pad to hover in place. Do you lift your left thumb off of that stick, lose all movement, and then tap down on the D-pad? Or do you waste fuel and time continuously pressing A while trying to keep some semblance of aim by brushing the right stick with the edge of your right thumb? I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed. If you want to use the jetpack, the best way to do so is when exploring, and not when trying to hose down enemies. This actually made for some fun experimentation with just how far you could attempt to clear dangerous gaps, and meld it into the rest of the platforming by giving you some leeway when you need a moment to collect yourself before performing the next required sequence of actions. I played this game on the normal difficulty, as I do with most new releases since it's the closest to what the developers intend to not be frustratingly hard or boringly easy. I won't say a whole lot here, just that to me, it felt like a couple of the boss fights may have been slightly overtuned for normal difficulty. I didn't fail encounters often, I think maybe 4 to 5 times when it wasn't just mistiming a jump or accidentally walking off of a platform, but when I did lose, I lost in spectacular fashion. A lot of times, it was mechanics based, like a boss going immune for a lengthy duration, forcing you to run away while absolutely chunking your health, or not leaving you enough time between their attacks to actually shoot back as they move so radically around the field it makes them almost impossible to hit. These are things that could easily be patched in the future if they decide to. I just don't know if or when they'll deem it necessary. One thing that did feel awful was a glitch that happened to me twice in a row on the second boss fight. For those who don't want spoilers but want to avoid getting stuck, you can reset the encounter by going into the menu and returning to the last checkpoint. I'll leave a timestamp here to carry on with the rest of the review and give you a moment to leave. For those who don't care about getting spoiled, the fight in question is against Krubus, a G3 boss with drills for hands and on his head. One of his most annoying attacks sees him burying himself underground and then sending lasers across walls, floors, and pillars to indicate where he's going to be digging across the air in rapid succession. This attack is already frustrating enough as he becomes unhittable and goes on for what feels like at least 20 seconds. But then he can just get stuck. Like, he ends the attack but never resurfaces to fight you again. From what I remember, both times I had whittled down his health to below half, and the first, I believe he was left with only a sliver. Having to repeat this fight 3 times just because of a glitch that should have been caught in testing is inexcusable in my opinion. There's no way it didn't show up if it happens often enough to do it twice in a row to me. Now, I know that so far, a lot of what I've said can come off as scathing negativity, but it's not all terrible. I did genuinely enjoy playing High on Life at times. It just has some really rough edges that I hope Squanch Games can sand down in a sequel that is surely being planned as I speak. A lot of the gameplay elements I mentioned were also probably paired with the developers keeping in mind that it's a game that's not meant to be taken seriously. You're shooting talking alien guns at guys covered in yellow goop armor to keep them from smoking your fellow humans in hyperbongs. For what feels like their first major outing, it plays a lot better than it could have.
Zephyr Paradise. Gorgeous, huh?
It might sound odd to call a game full of toilet humor beautiful, but I really do think that the art team has done a great job with High on Life. The staunch juxtaposition between the Earthling reality you know and the Futurama-esque alien worlds becomes immediately apparent from the first time you see your house nestled amongst Blim City skyscrapers. And yet, at the same time, it somehow doesn't look that out of place in the game. From the lush jungles of Zephyr Paradise to the old western aesthetic of Port Turine and the urban slums that lie at the heart of Blim City, the colorful environments are detailed and varied enough to keep the game feeling fresh. All of the locales here feel lived in and alive, but I do kind of wish there had been more of them. Technically, there are only 3 main areas to explore, but each one is smartly divided into sub-areas that add more distinct flavor, like the mines underneath Zephyr Paradise, where the world's population of teddy bear creatures have been forced into slave labor. This, combined with the Metroidvania style of exploration that has you return to each location with new traversal tools at your disposal, makes them feel more expansive than they actually are. Something that you can always say about Squanch's ventures is that they are creative, even if their style of gross out and sometimes outright repulsive creativity isn't your bag. The motley characters the team have put together to fill these spaces are no exception. Unfortunately, there doesn't feel like enough variety in the friendly or the enemy designs, with only a handful of named species on either side. Almost all of your enemies come in the form of guys covered in yellow goop, with a small smattering of changed looks to signal different ways they will attack you. The friendly aliens you interact with on a regular basis are mostly generic humanoids with differences in height, clothes, amounts of eyeballs or appendages, and colors. They also share a small set of reused animations that you'll notice every time you talk to one. There's probably a time and cost saving measure, as I could imagine ringing up dozens of aliens and giving them their own unique sets of animations would be taxing on Squanch's small team. At least what is here is good enough to get the job done without coming off as lazy. I did see a few visual bugs in my time playing the game, some of which were only slightly distracting, and some that left me scratching my head wondering how they even got there. As I said before, many animation rigs are reused here for a lot of different characters, some having slightly different sizes and anatomy, which leads to arms clipping through heads and bodies occasionally. A couple of times I would watch as a character slid across the ground, momentarily forgetting their walking animation. It's fine, it didn't happen that often, and there have been much worse visual bugs in full price games. I did encounter a really odd one, which I'll just play on screen here, where a guy is supposed to be going through drug withdrawals on the ground, but then randomly pops up to a standing position in the middle of his monologue.
You were never even gonna ever get my Fergles.
The strangeness didn't stop there, as very late into the game, my bounty hunter straight up forgot how to hold his guns, as his hands now hover in front of the alien grips, which was funny, but also made for a couple of awkward cutscenes where you interact directly with the Gatlians. Probably the worst offender was the scanner for the objective marker, which impacts gameplay directly. There is no map or minimap to speak of in this game, which makes you reliant on an objective marker that you can ping at any time by pressing up on the D-pad. This marker makes a really bad habit of appearing in the wrong location, popping up behind you right after it leads you in a different direction, and sometimes vanishing into thin air. My first time on Zephyr Paradise, I got distracted by a winding path that led to some treasure on my way to the main objective. Pressing the ping button gave no visual marker, leaving me stranded for about 20 minutes in an area with no clear exit. Those bugs aside, I did enjoy what they had to offer with the aesthetic side of things. Some of the map layouts could have been less confusing, sure, but at least they were neat to look at and play in.
It's Drungle Funk Flute time!
Okay, you know what? I'll admit it. This is good. This is good.
One of the things you'll notice in your time spent playing High on Life is the original soundtrack by musical artist and composer Tobacco. His otherworldly blend of psychedelic electronica composed of lo-fi beats, lofty rhythm sections, and spacey, flanger-affected bass lines practically make this game what it is, and fit flawlessly with a goofy, drug-ridden sci-fi atmosphere. After having played the game, I just couldn't imagine a different genre or a different artist taking its place, with songs that give you the feeling that you're in a strange new world where you don't exactly fit in. I'm always a fan of a distinct and memorable video game OST, so I give the team an A+ for working with them on this one. A couple of my favorite tracks were the Zephyr Paradise and Porterine main themes. The rest of the sound design here wasn't terrible, but after hearing what the wonderful music did for the game, I was left wanting more. The quality of sound effects are all over the board. Most of the obvious ones, like the Gatlian shooting and reloading sound effects, using knifey to tether, boosting around the world using the dash ability, etc., are perfectly fine. Some of the effects definitely need improvement, like the sounds of impacts and projectile hits, which don't carry as much weight as they should. But where the game really loses out is in the placement and mixing of effects that should be minimal or tucked further away from the player's location. With the amount of voiced Gatlian dialogue, backing music, Foley effects, and sounds from other sources like TVs or enemy combat parks, I unfortunately became well acquainted with the sensory overload and the chaos of High on Life's worlds. I understand the developers want for the audience to catch every quip and one-liner, but a lot of times it comes off as garbled noise that's trying its damnedest to be funny.
Health, it's just good for you.
Luckily, there are sliders on the menu to change the levels of the sound effects, music, and voice volumes, which come out of the box a little bit unbalanced in my opinion. It would have been nice to be able to reduce the frequency and volume on other individual sources, like separating the sound effects and voice volume into things the character does to make noise and things the world does to make noise. On a brighter note, the game has stellar voice acting behind almost every character. The line deliveries from the cast are executed with sniper-like precision and make good jokes land with a splash. Of course, if you're familiar with Rick and Morty or any of the other works where Roiland lends his voice, you'll immediately be able to pick out Kenny's stammering, whiny tones as the same Morty voice he uses in those properties. There's also the usual suspects you'd expect to find in almost any modern game, like Noah North, Jennifer Hale, and Tara Strong. You might also recognize some of the other comedic actors from the supporting cast, like JB Smoove playing Gus, another Gatlian you acquire early in the game, or David Herman playing Gene. Zach Hadel, also known as Psychic Pebbles of YouTube and Adult Swim's Smiling Friends fame, is another easily recognizable voice who also appears in several notable NPC roles. High on Life is not immune to audio bugs, of which I encountered many. Characters randomly starting and stopping dialogue mid-sentence, desync with the subtitles where the text got almost a paragraph ahead of where the spoken words were, audio coming from unintended sources or through solid walls, and audio playing earlier or later than the developers intended. Most of the stuff is minor, so I won't dig too deep into it, but I do think the QA team probably found most of these problems and decided they were okay with being shipped and patched later. Ultimately, High on Life is a fun experience where the journey is a joke and the destination is a punchline. The worlds and environments are a joy to explore, the characters and music are bright and expressive, but in my opinion, the rough underlying bones of the gameplay and the game's unrelenting need to prove that it knows how to be funny hold it back from greatness. There's plenty to love here for people who thrive on extremely dark and dirty humor, but if that's not quite to your taste, you'd probably be okay skipping this one. 6.8 out of 10. Hey, LegenTerry here. If you made it all the way to the end, thanks for watching. I hope you found the review at least slightly informative and entertaining. If you really want to help me out, hit that like button and subscribe for more nerdy content like this. Hope to catch you next time. Bye.